Welcome to 60 Skills. Today's class is the creation of elementaries. What is an elementary? An elementary is an artificial life form created by a magician to aid the magician's practice. Elementaries will help you further refine your magical skills, reinforce discipline, aid in your ascension, and generally make it easier to do things. They are in fact created out of you. And as such, they can also represent a very specific but higher part of you. So, if you want to learn how to make an elementary, join 60 Skills today as we learn everything there is to know about the creation of elementaries. Welcome to 60 Skills. What are the requirements for the creation of an elementary? Well, it is highly advisable that as a practitioner, you have already gained access to your own Akasha and non-dual light before you do this. At a minimum, you need to have access to vital, astral, and mental energy out of which to create the elementary. Now, this is in terms of the basic skills required to actually put an elementary together. However, there are additionally two things you need to do in advance of making an elementary. First, you need to derive a sigil, that is, a sacred drawing of your prospective elementary, as well as a name for your elementary. These are things that need to be done in advance of actually attempting to make one. And the reason for this is simple. You are in fact creating an artificial life form out of yourself. As such, this artificial life form has a kind of limited cognizance and intelligence of its own. Therefore, it requires a name and sigil by which to call on it. Additionally, you may want to have another sacred object, such as a crystal ball, in which to store the elementary. This is particularly helpful if you are dealing with multiple elementaries at one point in time. Now, this course will not cover the creation of sigils. You need to figure out how to do that on your own. There are a variety of methods that exist for doing this, all of which work very well. So those are the requirements for the creation of your own elementary. Welcome to 60 Skills. What is an elementary? Well, simply put, an elementary is an artificial life form created by a magician. Okay, what does this mean? Essentially, you are using your own base physical energies to break off a small part of yourself, temporarily, and we'll get to this later on, in order to create a practice partner that aids in your magical development. Elementaries can also be used for things like achieving certain goals, aiding in your ascension, development of specific skills, etc., etc. But again, fundamentally, an elementary is actually made out of you. Ideally, you need access to your own Akasha and non-dual light to do this, and the reason for this is very important. You need access to these energies so that you are engaging the higher part of your nature when you create this artificial life form. It can also be done with a mix of vital, astral, and mental energy, but in that case you need to make sure that you take efforts to be in a very pure state of mind, or what we call equilibrium, before doing so, because you don't want the baser aspects of your nature directly affecting the creation of this artificial life form. Now again, this is a part of you, and it will be designed to return to you at some point in time. Additionally, elementaries work best when they have a very specific purpose in mind. Examples of this include helping you develop clairvoyance, nurturing longevity, aiding in the performance of certain kinds of austerities. You get the idea. So these are the things that go into making an elementary and are the reasons why you would want to do that. However, in the next segment, we will get into some more specific reasons as to why you would wish to create your own elementary. But again, fundamentally remember, an elementary is an artificial life form created by you. In many ways, your relationship with this entity will be even more intimate than with your own children, because your children are a product of you and your spouse. An elementary is made entirely of you proper. Let us begin. Welcome to 60 Skills. We will now discuss why you would want to make an elementary. As was discussed earlier, elementaries need to be designed around a very specific purpose. Things such as development of or improvement of clairvoyance would be a good example of this. Additionally, you could use an elementary to do things like improve certain lifestyle habits. Also, to make sure you practice on time, to make sure you practice certain things. You could make one for the achievement of a particular goal. You could take a close look at your precepts, for example, for some inspiration regarding what kind of elementary that you wish to create. Keeping in mind, again, these things work best when they have a very specific goal to pursue. The more specific, the better. Now also keep in mind, you can have more than one elementary at the same time. The only issue with this is the care and feeding of these entities, which we will discuss in a moment, can become a bit cumbersome if you have too many of them. Now, let me be very clear that when you fully empower one of these entities, their given purpose is something that they will hone in on with a high degree of accuracy, particularly if you are using Akasha and non-dual light to create the entity. In this case, you will literally be harnessing a part of your higher nature to ensure the accomplishment of a certain goal. So do not be surprised that when the entity asserts itself in your field of consciousness with great regularity throughout a day. Also on this note, because you are creating an artificial life form, you need to be doing this for something very important. Elementaries should not be casually created. They require a tremendous amount of energy from a practitioner to create in the first place, and require a great deal of care and feeding as well. So this is not something to be done casually or in a cavalier manner. So these things are designed to aid your personal practice, or as some would say, to aid your ascension. Again, they are made out of you, and their lives are as important to them as your life is to you. Now, in a moment, we will talk about lifespan, care and feeding, and other details involved with the creation of an elementary. But the simple fact of the matter is, the more energy you put into an elementary, the more apt it is to have a positive effect upon your development. Also remember that as a part of you, they ultimately desire to return to you. So their lifespans tend to be quite limited, and again, we will get to that in a moment. So as you're going through this coursework, put some serious thought into a handful of things that you would want legitimate help with. And these are the kinds of things and the reasons why you would ultimately wish to create an elementary. Let us begin. Welcome to 60 Skills. We will now discuss the requirements for physically creating an elementary. All right, as was mentioned earlier, you're going to need to do some groundwork before you actually sit down to bring an elementary to life. The first three parts of this shouldn't require a lot of explanation, but we're going to give it a little bit anyway. Again, first you need a purpose, and this needs to be a serious purpose. Specifically because you will be drawing upon Akasha and non-dual light, you will literally be taking a piece of yourself to create the elementary. So this should be dealt with in a well thought out, if not sacred manner. If you are choosing to do this with vital, astral, and mental energy, on the other hand, you need to take the additional steps to thoroughly establish equilibrium in various austerities and esoteric hygiene practices to make sure the energies you are using to create the entity are done with the purest energies available to you. So again, you first need to map out the purpose of the entity that you are about to create, because that is going to affect a lot of what we are going to do next. Next, you will need to design a sigil for the entity. Sigil design can be very simple or very complex, and this is something quite beyond the scope of a 1-hour course, so you're going to need to do some homework to figure out the method that works best for you, whether this is path working and mental wondering, the release process, or any number of other methods for designing sigils. But you will need a sigil for this entity as well. Next, you will need a name for the entity. And the reason for this is very simple. This is a living creature. It will have a name. It will have a life, and that life will be as important to it as it is to you. But really, it's also being important to you because it's being made out of you and fed by you. We will get to that part in a moment. So the purpose, sigil, and name of the entity must be determined prior to your sitting down to actually bring the entity into life. Next, and this is also extremely important, you need to pre-program the lifespan of the elementary you are creating. This can be a minute, an hour, a week, a day, a month, or at most 1 year. And there is an important reason for this. As was mentioned earlier, you are using an elementary to help with your development, magically speaking. This should be focused on very discrete skills, the result of which is the development of those skills should happen rather rapidly. This is not designed to be a multi-year quest if you're using an elementary. So there is a sense of urgency that should be put into the efforts of the elementary, because ultimately that elementary wants to return to creation and you. 2, the longer an elementary lives, the more will it will develop on its own. As a simple practical matter, elementaries that survive for more than a year tend to be very difficult to control. They develop a will of their own, and they can get up to all kinds of trouble. Because again, these things are alive and they want to live. And if it's taking you more than a year to develop a specific skill, they might start getting the idea that you're not too serious about developing that skill, and therefore that they have better things to do with their time. This is ultimately extremely costly to you because you're essentially breaking off a part of yourself and turning it loose in the universe. So you need to decide again, before you sit down to create the elementary, what lifespan that entity should have. Whether that's a minute, an hour, a day, a week, a month, or a year, or sometime in between. But again, it should never exceed 1 year. Also, we need to talk a little bit about the shape of the entity. You see, a lot of people just use a generic ball or sphere shape for their elementaries. But this doesn't have to be the case. And additionally, depending upon the kind and shape of sigil that you've designed for your elementary, this is something that can be a variety of shapes. Now keep in mind, creating a shape coherently in your mind to fill with these various energies is a skill that has to be developed through various visualization and energy manipulation exercises. As such, you're probably beginning to figure out that between the need to have access to your own akasha, your own non-dual light, the ability to form a concrete shape in your mind and maybe the astral level, that this is not something that is to be done cavalierly or by someone who hasn't done a fair amount of work. The stories of Elementaries getting out of hand and getting up to all kinds of mischief are legend, and these warnings should be taken very seriously. Especially seriously because, again, if one of these things gets away from you, well, you're losing part of yourself, and that's no small thing. So again, the shape of the elementary is up to you. I would strongly recommend against using a humanoid or animal shape, because this seems to aid the development of an independent cognizance among the entity and ultimately makes them much more difficult to control. But the choice is in fact up to you. Now, additionally, we're going to circle back to the purpose of the entity for a moment. You're creating an artificial life form with an elementary. As I've stated many times before, and I will state many more times during the course of this instruction. The energy associated with that elementary is inherently important relative to its purpose. Now, of course, if you're creating a living being, you need akasha, non-dual light, mental energy, astral energy, and vital energy, because those are the things that make things live. But depending upon the purpose of the entity, you're also going to require additional energies. So those of you familiar with, say, the Kabbalah, who wanted to work on a fertility entity, you might want some water element for a woman. Or maybe the letter D, some fire element for a man. So you need to put a lot of thought into the exact kind of energy that you choose to charge your elementary with. Because chances are, if you've done all the work to get to this point, you're going to realize that for the elementary to be most effective, you have to include those energies relevant to its given purpose. So to sum up, you need to have a purpose, a sigil, a name, a lifespan of the elementary in question, a shape, and an idea of the different energies that you wish to employ. Additionally, you will want to write this sigil down, perhaps in specific colors. Again, it depends on how specific and long-term you want the entity to be, on a sheet of paper and keep that in your magical notebook. Finally, you need to put some thought into how you want the entity to function around you. Some entities, depending upon their lifespan, should just exist in space and follow you around. This is particularly helpful if you only have one or two of them, and they're involved with specific habits that you wish to reform. On the other hand, if you have a variety of entities, and some people make as many entities as there are magical skills they choose to work on, so in this case there could be upwards of 60, it's most convenient to store them in a magical device of some kind. We'll talk a little more about this in the future, but you may want to put some thought into the kind of magical device that you would use storage for multiple entities. That way you can charge the energies required for multiple entities at the same time. So that's a little thought on the main parts of creating an elementary. Let us begin. Welcome to 60 Skills. We will now discuss the care and feeding and funeral rites of elementaries. All right, as has been mentioned earlier in the course of instruction, an elementary is a living being. They mostly exist on the mental and astral level. However, as living beings, they need to be fed. They need to be fed regularly, and in this case, they need to be fed daily. So you'll need to take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes a day to feed your elementary or elementaries. In this case, you will be using all of the energies you used to create the elementary, with one possible exception. So you'll want to use Akasha, you'll want to use mental energy, you'll want to use astral energy, you'll want to use vital energy, and you'll want to use any other of the energies associated with the purpose of that elementary. You may or may not wish to apply Akasha to the elementary. Why is this? Well, Akasha can have a loosening or dissolving effect on the elementary. So you're going to have to feel out whether you want to incorporate that or not. Now keep in mind, this is something you have to do daily. The daily application of these energies to your elementary keeps it vital and allows it to function well. Otherwise, it's going to kind of drift off. Now, if this only happens every once in a while because you're particularly busy or you're simply too worn out, that's okay. But keep in mind, if you give this elementary an exceptionally long lifespan, like let's say 90 or 180 days, or a year, or make the mistake of not giving it a set lifespan, once this thing gets hungry enough, it's going to start going other places so it can look to be fed. And because it's made out of you, you are going to be on the hook for whatever mischief it gets up to. Additionally, elementaries that learn how to feed themselves acquire quite a bit of will in terms of their long-term survivability. They become very difficult to control, and they can get up to all kinds of shenanigans. Most importantly, poorly fed or unfed elementaries aren't helping you achieve your goals and are quite expensive because they were made out of you. So keep in mind, you will want to care and feed for your elementaries on a daily basis for as long as they're designed to be alive. If their lifespan is very short, say a minute, an hour, or a day, okay, not so relevant. On the other hand, if they have a longer lifespan, this is something you're going to have to keep up with. All right. Now, if you only have one elementary at a time, you can just bring it before you by calling its name, or maybe writing its sigil in the air, and then charge it in front of you. This is done easily enough. However, if you in fact have multiple elementaries, say one for each of the 60 skills in the 60 skills curriculum, or in a curriculum like Initiation into Hermetics, or some other complicated curriculum, doing that is going to take an awful lot of time. So there's an alternative. As we mentioned earlier, you can store an elementary inside a sacred object. Whether this is a given gemstone, a certain kind of carving, crystals work best, just so you know, or a crystal ball, that is up to you. Of course, you'll want to purify and clean the object that it is going to inhabit before you utilize it. This goes without saying, but is worth reinforcing. The advantage to doing this is you can store multiple elementaries in the same device. This way, when it comes time to feed them, you put the device in front of you, you charge it up with all the various energies required by all the various entities. In this way, you only have to apply non-dual light, Akasha, mental energy, astral energy, and vital energy once, in addition to whatever ancillary energies you're going to be using based upon the purpose of your other entities. So a clairvoyance-oriented entity would, of course, need a little fire element, whereas a clairaudience-oriented entity would require a little bit of air element. So on and so on and so on. So this is the advantage of having a storage device set up in advance for your elementary. Okay, now we're going to get to one of the most important parts of the care and feeding of an elementary. Finally, its funeral. Again, these are living creatures, artificially created of course, but alive nonetheless. They are made out of you, they have a name, they have a symbol, they have a purpose, they have a life. So when they die, and most importantly, they have some degree of intelligence and cognizance of their own. So when they die, you need to give them a funeral. Now, the funeral rites don't need to be particularly complex, but at a minimum should consist of a sheet of paper with the sigil written on it, maybe in the appropriate colored ink if you want to go that route. And then you should hold a short, simple ceremony thanking the elementary for all of its work in helping you achieve your goals. Maybe talking a little bit about your interactions with it if it existed for, any real length of time. Then you wish it well, and then you release the elementary back into the universe. Best done by dissolving it with the kasha. Once you've done this, and this can take as little or as long as you want, then you burn the sheet of paper all the way down to ash. None of it should remain. And at that point, you turn and walk away, and the elementary should have dissolved back into you. You may actually find a huge uptake of energy into your body when this happens, as a kind of reverse function of the creation of elementaries, which is generally quite draining to the practitioner and purpose. So again, put a little thought into the ceremony. This is an intelligent, living being made out of you, and it is returning to you having finished a given goal that you designed it for. So, as always, put some thought into this and treat it in a sacred manner. Wear clean clothes, wash your hands, this kind of thing. But the funeral aspect of working with an elementary is also important, because keep in mind, ultimately these things are made from you and are returning to you. Let us begin. Welcome to 60 Skills. We will now cover the theory portion of how you're going to create an elementary. Okay, so as was stated before, this is an artificial life form. You've already figured out the purpose, you've given it a sigil, you've given it a name, you've decided how long it's going to live for, and most importantly, what energies you are going to project into it. Now, ideally, this is performed at dawn along the side of a river. The reason for this is particular to rivers and the running of water in the early morning, simply generating a lot more ambient energy on which to draw upon. So what you're going to do is you're going to sit there, you're going to open up all your subtle bodies. You're going to visualize the shape of the entity that you choose to work with. Again, in many cases, a simple sphere works well, but depending upon the nature of the entity, you may need something else. You will then draw the sigil that you've chosen for the entity onto the shape that it is to inhabit. Next, you can even whisper the name of the entity. Then you are going to begin to layer various energies into the shape in front of you, starting with vital, then with astral, then with mental, then with akashic, then with non-dual light, and then with whatever other energies that particular entity requires for existence. So for example, an entity devoted to vitality and health would want the letter L from Barden's Kabbalah. If you don't know Kabbalah, you're simply going to need to figure out what specific energies you want to apply and generate them as necessary. At a minimum, you are going to want 9 breaths of each energy. So that's 9 breaths each of the base energies, vital, astral, mental, if you can, akashic, non-dual light, plus its supporting energies. You're going to want to push that energy into that shape as strongly as you can. Now you are going to continue to do this and cycle through until there is this sense of magical tension. For those of you who have practiced ritual systems, you're probably already familiar with this. But when working with large amounts of contained energy, there becomes a moment where reality seems to change a little bit. It's hard to explain, but it is one of these things that you will know when you actually encounter it. At that point in time, you continue until you finish the progression through all the different energies involved. Then you take the energy and you snap it into reality, releasing it up into the sky, releasing that shape, this newborn entity. You can even shout its name, if you wish, at the same time. Now, because of this, you're going to want to do this ideally someplace in private. It doesn't have to be done that way, but maintaining your focus on the shape, the sigil, the name, the energies, any of the other colors and associated things with that entity can be quite difficult if people are around interrupting you or simply being a distraction. So again, 9 breaths of each energy until you establish this kind of magical tension. Then you finish the list of energies. Then you take this charged shape and you shoot it into the sky and you shout the name of the entity. This will release the entity into reality. At this point, once you're finished, you will call upon the name of the entity and you should feel it come before you. Keeping in mind that the entity will grow more intelligent and more active over time, assuming you feed it properly. At this point in time, you can also place the entity into a sacred object. Again, this could be a crystal ball, it could be a small sacred object, it could be a small stone, a ring, whatever that thing is. And this will become the entity's home for the duration of its existence. Now, if the entity is only to exist for a minute, an hour, a day, then that may not be necessary. But again, these are all things that you have to figure out in advance before you do this. So specifically, if it helps, you may want to write out all the steps involved on a sheet of paper or a note card as you go along. But energetically, you take the shape, you take the sigil, you take the name, 9 breaths of each energy until you reach the point of magical tension. Then you snap or release the entity into existence while shouting its name. After that, you're down to care and feeding. So these are the basics in theory of how you create an elementary. In a moment, I'm actually going to generate one in front of you. Keeping in mind the full process can take up to an hour. For reasons involving recording time and online storage, I will be doing this quite a bit quicker. But again, with practice and proper preparation, if you're able to generate magical tension quickly, you can do this a lot quicker. So again, this is one of those things that benefits your development as a practitioner in a variety of ways. Let us begin.